Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture 55 of week 11 and the title of today's lecture is More About Language Teaching. So, we have been talking about language teaching since the last class. We basically talked about the methods and also the different kind of changes that took place in the methods. Today, we will be talking about the child's role in a language classroom, of course, keeping in mind the acquisition factors, the teacher's role in language classroom, keeping in mind the methods that we have already discussed, and we will also discuss 4 different skills of language classrooms. So, if we think about contemporary classrooms, in the last class we talked about different language teaching methods, and also I asked you to think about the existence of different language teaching methods and changes if you have marked any. So, if you think about contemporary classrooms, you can tell me at this point that many of those methods are still adopted in the classrooms, right. But when we consider people who work with children, they also observe the language development of children. What do I mean by language development? If you go back to the initial classes where we talked about the knowledge of language, keeping in mind Plato's problem, poverty of stimulus, etc., we did talk about the language acquisition. So, we are coming back to the language development component while talking about language teaching as well. So, in terms of development, we talk about the structure, acquisition of different structural components, we talk about interactional factors in classroom, and along with that we also talk about certain issues related to attitude that we have learnt in sociolinguistics. So, you can understand that when we discuss language teaching, we take a multi-method approach. We draw from structural linguistics, we also draw from sociolinguistics. So, at this point I am asking you to think about the role of language in a child's life. You can say that words and actions go together. Children are asked to read, they are asked to write, speak and listen at the school. You can say at the home domain as well. If you consider what do children do in terms of language, you can say that when children bring different objects to the classroom, for example, chalk, stone, leaves, broken things, pencil, etc., they are also asked to talk about them, listen to others when one child is talking, write about them at a later stage, and also read whatever they have written. So, we are talking about different skills associated to language teaching activities in a classroom. So, you can say that yes, there are different skills, but we also analyze the skills and do an in-depth analysis and try to relate it to language structure and acquisition and sociolinguistic factors. So, it is very important for us to talk about all 3 together: structural aspects, acquisition aspects and sociolinguistic aspects. So, children at times are also taken out of their rooms to observe the surrounding, when they also talk about the surroundings, listen to others and all the 4 skills that I have mentioned. Apart from that, if you pay attention, you will be realizing that children talk about many things. So, we are focusing on children's talk, and when I am using the term children's talk, I will ask you to consider language acquisition. So, children talk about what they do, what they see, and when we are saying that children talk about many things, as language teaching experts, it is important for us to consider that talk is also a means of learning. So, one can talk about oneself, talk about objects and experiences at school, talk about pictures and videos. So, these talks are important as data. Talks are also important as there are different functions associated with them. For example, there are findings, projecting, predicting and relating functions. Children make stories, they also act, So, you can consider a classroom as a space, you can also consider any other place outside the classroom if you are thinking about a child's language use. So, in psycholinguistics we talk about different stages of language development. I am not going to discuss the stages here, but I will tell you that these are aligned with the overall development of the child, and language development has certain milestones. For example, when we talked about the bioprogram, the idea of biological nativist theory. So, we talked about the fact that there are certain milestones. If you remember, we also said that direct teaching has very little effect on the language. So, in language development we have certain milestones. For example, babbling, we have one word utterances, we have two word utterances, etc. And these milestones are available in all the languages. So, children if they acquire different languages, all of them will go through the same milestone. That is a major point of language acquisition. So, if we think about the teacher's role as a language teacher, you can say that language is used for all the classes. That is why there is an entire domain called language across the curriculum. But here we are mostly focusing on language classrooms, but for your purpose you can consider any other content area if you wish to talk about the use of language in those classes. So, when the teachers teach, they use different linguistic skills. This is very important, and what do we mean by that? We will explain. Teaching includes the teaching of pronunciation, which is related to phonetics, vocabulary, which is related to partially lexical semantics, partially morphology, grammar, which is related to syntax, and topic, situation, notion, function, etc., which is related to both semantics and pragmatics. So, we basically draw our knowledge of theoretical linguistics and apply them in classrooms. That is why language teaching is also considered as a domain of applied linguistics, though it overlaps with theoretical linguistics, psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics. So, the teachers not only teach, but they also do other things like conducting different kinds of tests. I have given example of two different kinds of tests here. One is a diagnostic test, which is to find strong and weak points of a learner, and also a prognostic test, which is basically related to how well a learner is likely to do in a language test to find out that. So, when we talk about teaching pronunciation, we of course draw from a knowledge of phonetics and partially phonology. So, we talk about accents. So, pronunciation includes listening to accents, identifying errors in pronunciation if any, and also considering suprasegmental factors of language like rhythm, stress, intonation. When we talk about teaching of vocabulary, we talk about presentation of new vocabulary, and we will also come to this point when we will talk about skills and how a child or an adult learner remembers the existing vocabulary. When we talk about teaching grammar, you can relate it to syntax, as I have told you, rather morphosyntax. So, we talk about, you can say grammatical and lexical category, of course, but we can also say parts of speech and grammatical terms. And when we talk about tasks in classroom, we can consider structure based task. So, while talking about these tasks in language teaching, we often draw from our knowledge of rules in theoretical linguistics. Along with that, if you consider teaching of topic, situation, notion, function, etc., you can talk about teaching a chunk of text, and from a text you can move to a task. You can talk about teaching chunk of a language, where you can move from a task to a text, and combining different segments of language for teaching these elements. Now, let us talk about the skills. So, this is something that all of us know, but maybe we have not paid enough attention to the skills separately. So, the 4 different linguistic skills are listening, reading, speaking and writing. So, it is LSRW, and language proficiency is related to accuracy and fluency. So, when we talk about language proficiency, how proficient the learner is, it will be related to both accuracy and fluency. And if you talk about accuracy related activities, it will be a focus on discrete elements like sounds or words. If you talk about fluency activities, you can consider texts as whole piece of discourse like stories or conversation. Now, let us talk about the listening skills. So, when we say that we are talking about listening, the first question that you will ask is, what do students listen to in a classroom? You can consider child learners, you can consider adult learners, and you can consider different levels of learning according to your own examples. So, the students listen to different situations, for example, interviews, instructions, and if there is some loudspeaker announcement going on, radio news, telephone conversation as a part of listening activity. Of course, lesson or lectures of the teachers, conversation that is taking place in the classroom, and storytelling. So, when we talk about these different situations in terms of listening, we can say that there are different components of it. There are different chunks when we are listening to something. We do pay attention to the pronunciation. Now, you know more about IPA and phonetics. So, you can of course think about different aspects of it. Vocabulary. We also listen to some noise which is there with the which is coming in the scenario where some sentences are being spoken. Certain information will be redundant. So, we also include the redundancy factor in listening, and there are repetition of course. So, there are different kinds of activities related to listening skills which are done in classroom, which are conducted. For example, stories are used, maybe audio, maybe the teacher is reading out a story, maybe a student is reading out something. Then songs are played, films are often screened. Of course, it is related to some other skills. There are short responses based on listening activities. So, maybe if you are playing a song, you can ask the students to tick off items based on the listening. And there are some particular functions which are related to the listening exercise. So, it involves attention, it involves different targets like paraphrasing, summarizing, etc. Now, let us talk about speaking skills. So, speaking skill is extremely important in contemporary world because of foreign language teaching. So, if your target is to speak the language to a country where you are planning to migrate, then the language teaching will have speaking as a major component. And when we talk about speaking, speakers often say that there are factors like inhibitions, low or uneven participation, and at times use of mother tongue instead of target language. So, it is also a kind of avoidance strategy which compels the learner to use the mother tongue. In speaking skills, teachers use different kind of tasks in the classroom. For example, group task, there can be easy activities and which can be motivation for keep speaking in target language, which can be useful for the learner. And there can be topic and task based activities, for example, describing pictures, shopping lists, interactional talk, telling stories, describing a person or a place in detail. So, if you happen to access some language teaching material for foreign languages, then you can, and if you consider the materials that are targeting speaking activities, you can easily find the exercises which are talking about the list. Let us talk about reading skills now. So, what do we mean by reading? Reading is a complex process, but when we read, it is basically perceiving and decoding letters to read words. So, but you have to understand the words in order to decipher meaning. So, there is of course certain symbols which are involved, but meaning is also associated with reading. So, that is why I am saying reading is a complex process, it has some layers. Reading basically begins after gaining some basic knowledge on the target language. You cannot start reading activities on day 1 if the language is new, if the target language is new to you, and there are different methods for using the reading techniques. So, phonic method is a very popular method which is directly relating the sounds to the symbols. And if you consider literacy, which I have not mentioned on the slides. So, even in case of literacy, which is a first attempt to read some language, we often use the phonic method, and there has to be a difference between the literacy, the initial literacy, and learning of a second or foreign language, that we have to keep in mind. So, there are certain tasks which are often associated with reading activities. For example, learning common words and finding them from a text. So, you learn something, then a text is given, you have to find the word. So, in order to find the word, you have to read some amount of text, maybe sentences. Reading a text and answering questions. So, this is popularly known as comprehension, as all of us have done in schools. Also pre-questions. So, you before giving the text to the students, some questions are asked and then the texts are given and they try to find out answers. There are also activities like figuring out mistakes in the text, which will be directly related to the proficiency and learning of the speaker. And then comparison tasks are given and the content is represented. Maybe you are reading something, then you are asked to represent the content. So, while we consider reading skill, we talk about something like the content, speed of reading, attention, and different strategies that the learner take in order to master the reading skills. If we talk about the writing skills, now you can talk about both content and form. So, now you understand the difference between content and form. If you recall the theoretical examples that we had given while discussing Saussure, for example, those will be helpful. So, when we talk about content and form both, there is some kind of content that you have to present through writing, and also when you are writing you have to consider the rules of the language. Those will help you to present the content in certain ways. And of course, we focus on different linguistic items. What do I mean by different linguistic items? While writing, you can think about the sounds and association of sounds in terms of spellings. You can think about words, you can think about formation of sentences by putting different items together, organizing them together. So, this is how we are analyzing writing process with the help of the structural aspects of language. And if you think about different kind of writing tasks, you can talk about say reports, book review, instruction sheet. Of course, book review, instruction sheets are for older learners, and also narratives, personal essay, describing a view, etc. For younger learners, it can be limited to writing of particular alphabets or words, etc. At times, there are needs of rewriting, and if the target is not fulfilled, and also work on feedback by the teachers, and we need to focus on different kinds of errors. At this point, let me also tell you that error analysis is another domain of language teaching, which talks about typologies of errors and also the finding out the reason behind the errors based on the structural analysis of the languages. So, now I will talk about the need to know a classroom in order to describe the different skills associated with the classrooms. So, you learnt about the 4 skills, but why do you need to change the activities based on different skills at times? Will you be use the same skill based activities across classrooms? Of course, no. So, there is a need to think about the changes according to the nature of the learners and classroom. So, if we try to know a classroom, which is a major task for applied linguists or people who work on language teaching. So, we ask these questions: what kind of classroom is this? Is it a rural classroom, an urban classroom? It will be associated with different kinds of other factors. We also talk about the background of the children in terms of exposure to print rich environment. So, why am I using this term print rich environment? Because for certain learners the home domain will have access to print rich environment. There will be enough materials so that the child can go through the materials before coming to the school or parallel to the formal schooling. So, this is something we are of course talking about children and not adult learners. When we talk about teachers, we think about the teacher student ratio. Teacher student ratio also affects the choice of activities based on language skills, duration of class related to the attention span of the learners based on their age, background, etc. Setting of the classroom, if it is a noisy setting or quiet setting, or is it a formal setting or it is informal, the teacher can talk informally with the students. We also classify the classroom according to the languages. If it is a first language classroom, so I am of course talking about the formal definition of first language classroom. I am not intending to say that the mother tongue is always the formal first language. Then the second language, it can be anything according to the policy of the school. Third language, which is often a classical or foreign language for children. So, based on the choice of languages, the activities will be changing, all the activities based on 4 skills will be changing. And of course, if we are talking about children as learners or adult as learners, based on that the type of activities will change. And we also consider the purpose of learning, if it is only to communicate in the target language or just to get some basic knowledge, or it can be an advanced need for communication. So, at this point I will tell you that language acquisition and language teaching are closely related, as I have already mentioned. So, stages of language acquisitions are helpful for the teachers and teacher trainers. Language shift and attrition, if you remember, attrition is the first loss of first language. So, they can play a major role in the classroom, and we will be talking about this in detail later, and that is why it is often said that classroom is also considered as a space for language revitalization. So, if the children have lost their mother tongue, for example, and they are given a different language which is the formal language of the classroom, classroom itself can be used to revitalize or revive the language, to stop the language shift. And exposure to a language outside classroom is always helpful. So, if the child is accessing a language or learning a language formally which is not at all spoken outside the classroom, I mean in the community, in the environment of the child, then learning will be difficult for the child. So, if you consider this factor that whether a language is spoken in the outside domain or not outside the school, so you can consider about the nature of input, because you know we consider the nature of input whenever we are talking about language learning. I hope you remembered the idea of language acquisition device in this regard. So, we are coming to the conclusion part of the class. So, in today's class we talked about the fact that a child does different kinds of things, and of course, we tried to relate it with the child's talk. So, when the child is talking, he or she is talking about different kind of things, but we did argue that the child talk itself is an important ground for language teaching. We also talked about the teachers' roles in classroom. What do the teachers do in the classroom? So, we have to consider those factors, and we focused on different skills in language classroom. We also said that along with the structure and acquisition of language, we need to consider certain socio-linguistic factors, and together all these three things will constitute the domain of language teaching. So, these are the key references, and thank you.